Hi, Colonel Douglas Macgregor. How are you doing?
Wonderful.
Yeah, we were talking just before we started rolling on this a little bit about how you are a voice of enlightenment in all of this. I mean, whether people agree with what you say or not, you certainly have the bona fides to say it, and don't bring any agendas to the argument. But yet the pushback on you has been really, really over the top, hasn't it?
Yeah, I guess that comes with the territory these days. There's not much room for political realism in Washington, D.C.
They don't like it, do they?
No, we have lots of people that are once again doing things that we've done repeatedly on a number of failed interventions and try to posture morally and justify anything that the D.C. community wants to do on the grounds that they are somehow or another in charge of moral superiority and supremacy, and therefore anyone who disagrees with them is inherently immoral.
Yeah, there's something really, really wrong. And part of what's really wrong is that I'm waking up every day, at my age, worrying about nuclear war again, which is something I never thought I would live through. But it's not just worrying about nuclear war, it's being deeply, deeply affected by the casualness with which nuclear war seems to be being discussed right now. I mean, it's just awful.
Oh, you've just made a very important point, and you could not be more right. For some reason, having lived for decades in an environment where there was an understanding that whatever you did vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, you wanted to avoid a direct collision, because it could very rapidly escalate to the nuclear level, and everyone understood that that meant effectively the wholesale destruction of your civilization. Now, all of a sudden, when you mention it, the various neocons dismiss you out of hand as, oh, that's impossible. That will never happen, which I find interesting, but frightening, as you suggest, because if you threaten a country's existence, and it's not a stretch to argue that the Biden administration, supported overwhelmingly on both sides of the aisle by lots of wannabe political figures in Washington, D.C. I say wannabe because even though they may hold office, they don't all get the attention they crave.
Right.
Are all willing to stand up and threaten Russia, not just in Ukraine, but the Russian state and ultimately the Russian population. And when you listen to that, you have to ask yourself, what planet are these people on? Because that's the sole set of circumstances under which the Russians, I think, would use a nuclear weapon, is in the event that they thought we were interested in destroying them and would advance to their borders, which is ultimately one of the reasons that Putin made the decision to intervene in Ukraine, because he couldn't allow this presence right on Russia's border, literally within a flight time of a few minutes by any missile that we cared to station there, in range of Russian nuclear forces. But for some reason, nobody brings it up.
Nobody brings it up, and I'm really struggling with it because it makes me worried about a whole bunch of things about the ruling, elites these days, and how stupid or crazy they may be. I can't quite figure it out. But I know that you're a very, very highly regarded war fighter. You're the real deal. You've written books on strategy and held very high positions in the military. And I know that's your expertise, but I just feel like I need to run this by you too. What is going on psychologically, do you think, with these people that they just aren't getting it? Is it generational? Is it just that I think you and I are of the same generation within a couple of years, but is it just that we remember the threat of nuclear war and how it was talked about and how the anti-nuke people were so, great at really convincing us that this is something that should never happen? Or is there something else going on that I'm just not getting?
Well, Tricia, I think that's part of it. You're right. Anyone who grew up in the 50s, 60s, probably is acutely sensitive to the issue in ways that today's Americans are not. But I think there's something else at work, and that's the last 30 years. If you go back to 1990 and everything that's happened since Desert Storm, there has been this built-in assumption that there's no one else out there who can really challenge us. that we can act with impunity, that our power is limitless and inexhaustible. That there's literally anything that we want to do, we can do. And we've become very accustomed to bullying people, either by the use of the financial system and our control of SWIFT and these other things, and with the use of American military power. Either you agree with us, you do as we tell you to do, behave as we would like you to behave, or we threaten you. And under the worst conditions, we'll use American military power against you. And let's be frank, until Russia, none of the states that we have bullied or attacked or invaded or intervened in, whatever language you want to use, has been in a position to really defend themselves effectively against us. And we've decided that Russia is weak. Well, Russia is certainly far, far weaker as a state than the Soviet Union was. There's no question about that. But I think we've overreached, and we're trying to convince everyone in the world that they have overreached. And the point that I continue to make people is that there's a vast difference between the United States, that is thousands of miles away from this war, and Russia, who is literally fighting on their own doorstep. And that changes the equation, but we don't seem to get it.
Well, and I'm just, because I don't really follow the military so much. I mean, I do kind of, I guess, as a generalized reporter interested in knowing things. But I actually thought of this morning. Is the American military, given the situation it's in right now, right as we're speaking, you and I, would they be ready to take on Russia in an actual conflict between the two countries directly?
I think the short answer is no. I think anybody with any degree of understanding inside the Department of Defense would tell you that that's absolutely out of the question. But just stop and consider for a minute that we have largely depleted the stocks of these so-called Javelin missiles, as well as a host of other munitions and weapon systems in a very short period of time, simply by supplying the Ukrainians. We are not postured for anything that lasts longer than a few weeks, if that.
Wow.
And so the notion that we are prepared to fight anybody is outrageous. That doesn't even begin to address all the problems with how we're organized to fight and the morale problems that deeply affect the armed forces at the moment.
Yeah, that's really interesting you would say that, because obviously the last war was the Iraq war, I guess Iraq and Afghanistan, and the troops fought it because, Afghanistan was directly connected to 9/11, Iraq obviously not so, but the people who fought it thought it was when they went. That's why many of them signed up.
Right.
How would you guess American troops would feel now if they were dispatched to fight a war for Ukraine against Russia? Like, are they captured by the propaganda in the same way they were around Iraq, or are they smarter now and more suspicious now? I know they don't have a choice, but are they more suspicious now because of the WMD situation that didn't happen?
Well, I think it depends on what level you're talking about. What's disappointing to me is that people at the top over the last 30 years have been systematically selected to ensure that whoever ultimately reaches senior rank is a shameless conformist.
Right.
In other words, someone who's not going to question anything, who's simply going to go along.
Yeah.
So at the top, I think you've got lots of people who decided it's in their interest. Whatever comes down the road, it doesn't make much difference to them. It's simply in their personal interest. And I don't think they have any real warfighting experience. And what I mean by that is they haven't been in any pitched battles against an enemy that was remotely capable of challenging them. In other words, they've always, as senior officers, operated in an environment where we could dominate anybody with firepower instantly.
Yeah.
And effectively force our will on them. And they haven't had the experience of an environment in which it could go either way, depending upon what each side did. So that's part of the problem. The second thing is when you get down below the senior officer level, I think the officers that are in the middle, and by that I mean majors, lieutenant colonels, captains, they're much more sober-minded because they're inside the formations. They know the problems that they've got in those units. They know what units are at low end strength, in other words, that may be under strength. They know the true state of training. They know what they can and can't do with the weapon systems. There, I think people are much more sober-minded. I mean, the first question that anybody with any sense would ask is, well, if you send us into Ukraine, how far do you want us to go? And if you start talking about moving 180, 200, 300 miles, which is what that country requires to come to grips with the enemy, they're going to look at you and say, how do we do that? We don't have the infrastructure. We don't have the logistical support structure. How do we maintain command and control? I think there are a lot of sober-minded people there. And when you get to the enlisted level, the soldiers, and the only ones I can talk about are really combat soldiers. Most of the combat soldiers, infantry and armor, I think, look at this and say, are you a lunatic?
Yeah.
They're probably the most sober-minded people. They're closest to where the fighting is going to happen, and they see this is crazy.